So I often hear this argument that if we went back to the 1950s and it would be so much more easier to live, I would be able to work as a single income, and then I'd have this wonderful nuclear family with a white picket fence, and I would have this beautiful job and all of this kind of stuff without an education. Frankly, it's completely untrue and it's a complete disaster of a logic. I want you to look at some things in terms of the privilege that you have today to learn and to do great things. So first of all, I'm talking into the cell phone, which is a magical tool. Much of the stuff that you have in front of you right now, I want you to stop and look at it and think about when it was actually invented. And you'll realize, like, wait a minute, all of this stuff was invented after the 1950s. All of these things are magic that I would not have access to, and they're wonderful. You can't put a price on how much quality a cell phone puts into your life. And economists can't do that either. That's hard to actually measure because it gives you qualitative feelings that you can't measure. There's nothing that you could do there. The sort of connection and all of that kind of stuff, you can't feel that stuff. The other thing, I want you to look at a map of, and I don't want you to just look at the US or Canada or the UK. I want you to look at the map of life expectancy around the world in the 1950s. It's staggering how pathetic it actually was in the 1950s. It was a disaster. Many people were absolutely impoverished. Many people were hurting. You couldn't live, most people, the life expectancy around the world was like you wouldn't expect to live past 40 around the world. And even in the UK and the US, the life expectancy has risen since then. Now, the last few years has been a disaster for life expectancy in the United States, and that's mostly because of COVID and opium overdoses. But for the most part, it's been going up every single year. Now, the other thing you might be thinking is, well, it was so much more easier to have a job and to work back in the day. So I'm gonna give that to you, right? So it would have been easier to get a job without an education. Absolutely, that was true. But I want you to sort of think about what kind of houses people were living in and what access to things that they had. Most people were living in much, much smaller houses. Look at wartime houses from the 1940s and 50s. They were tiny. They were 800 square feet in most places around the United States and Canada. Now, like that's pretty modest. Most people would have been having one car, if that, right? Like pretty modest living. And then the other thing you're forgetting and you're neglecting is that, hey, it would have been privileged for a white male person to be living in the 1950s, right? Mostly white males. If you were female, you would not have had access to be able to work. And so a lot of people did not feel great in those relationships because they were stuck at home or because they couldn't do something that they really truly wanted to do. And the other thing to think about, wait a minute, I said Caucasian or white, right? What about all those people that didn't have that skin tone, that were considered a minority group or considered a minority group, right? Let's say that you were from a Latinx country, or that you had a much darker skin tone from somebody from Africa, for example. It was a disaster. You could not get an education. In most places in the United States, they had to separate. I live in a city right now where there's two universities because of the absolute the challenges that African Americans felt in the southern states. Two universities, one that was originally set up for white people, the other one that was set up for African Americans. I don't know. That seems a little bit suspicious to me. there is so many things, so many indicators, and how disastrous it was in the 1950s. We were still trying to figure out many different things. Even though we have a disastrous, we experience disastrous things in modern times, it is, for the most part, peaceful. For the most part, we live in many places around the world that are continuously getting better. For the most part, we have disagreements, but in terms of how things actually should be, but we have civilized disagreements, right? I want you to go back to the 1950s. It was still okay in many parts of the world that if you had some sort of disagreement with a government or, a political party, that they would, that they would do some nasty things to you. That was still pretty acceptable. Um, if you just look at every indicator, other than just a sliver of things, and for a very small group of people, right? Like a very small, if I was a white male in the 1950s, and not just a white male, right? Like I would had to have spoken English, perfect English, right? Like either it'd be American English if you lived in America, or yeah, it would be British English if I lived in the UK, or Canadian English if I lived in Canada, or whatever. If it was like that, then it was easy. But my dad was an immigrant, a Polish immigrant, and it was hard in the 1950s because he stuck out. He had an accent, all of those kind of things. I want you to stop and think before you start thinking about the good old days. It was a disaster, and we're working through some of those things. And I hope in 30 years it's going to be even better than what it is today. So please, please don't talk about the good old days. Things have gotten a lot better for many people in many situations today because of those nasty things called democracy and capitalism and all of those kind of things. Stop and think. We are doing far better today. You live in a privileged world. You have so many more opportunities that you would never have access to today than you did in the past.